I'd like to begin in 1945 and to delineate the three crises that the Holocaust left in its wake. Three crises for the Jewish people, and show how Israel in its first generation successfully resolved those three crises, successfully addressed those three crises, and then tried to come up with some updated possibilities for how we could begin looking at those three crises as well, because in certain ways they're back. The Holocaust left the Jewish people physically shattered, psychologically in a state of acute self-doubt, and spiritually forlorn. Physically shattered, just to look for a moment at what the Jewish map looked like in 1945. The Jewish heartland for hundreds of years, after it had moved from Muslim countries to Europe, was of course Eastern Europe, and that Jewish heartland was totally non-existent with the exception of the Soviet Union. 3 million Jews had survived in the Soviet Union, but were in a state of being forcibly assimilated. The government policy for the next 40 years was a systematic attempt to erase Jewish memory, a kind of enforced amnesia. So that in parts of Soviet Jewry already by 1945, you saw advanced symptoms of amnesia, which only intensified in the subsequent generation. Western Jewry, this was before the time of the Jewish Renaissance of the 60s and 70s. Western Jewry was in a state of moral collapse in terms of its identity, in terms of its vitality. Western Europe seemed to be in a state of unraveling. The most intact Jewish communities in 1945 were in Muslim countries, but these were communities that had long passed their golden era and were about to face a period of acute instability. Even had the State of Israel not arisen, the process of decolonialization, many of the Jews, especially in North Africa, had been identified with the French colonialist regime. The Jews in Arab countries were in a state of acute vulnerability. So that if you look at the Jewish world in 1945, what you saw was not a cohesive people, but fragments of a nation. In effect, atomized communities. Alongside this physical shattering was an acute psychological crisis of self-doubt about the worth of the Jewish people. The Jewish self-image was at an all-time low. And it has taken the Jewish people a generation, and of course Zionism played a crucial role in this, which we'll get to in a moment. But it took the Jewish people a generation to get over the fact that we hadn't actually gone like sheep to the slaughter. I believe that most Jews in 1945 believed to one extent or another that we did go like sheep to slaughter. And for me, the proof of that is a genre of literature that was very popular among American Jews in the 1950s, summarized by the title of a book that I had in my home when I was growing up, called Jews Fight Too! Exclamation mark. And it was a series of profiles of soldiers from World War II, a Jewish pilot, a Jewish naval hero, the kind of book that, if we were to look at it today, just the title as well, would seem as if it came really from another millennium. And in the 1950s, this issue was still acute enough for there to be a whole series of these kinds of books. In the Soviet Union, when the Jews that I spoke to, who began coming out in the 70s and the 80s, and I would ask them what it was like for them growing up in the 50s and the 60s, had a very similar narrative, which was they were almost universally accused of being cowards. The Jews don't fight. The Jews had all run to Asiatic Russia. They had all spent the war in Tashkent. And there was a whole genre of Soviet jokes about Jewish cowardice. So that you were dealing with a people that lacked the most basic sense of self-respect, justifiably or not. We're leaving that issue aside. So that was the psychological state of the Jewish people in 1945. The spiritual state of the Jewish people, the condition of Jewish belief, was, if anything, in more critical crisis than even our physical shattering and our lack of psychological intactness. Judaism, the basis of Judaism is the belief that there is a God who acts in history. That is the model of the biblical God. And the end point of Judaism is very much like its origins, which is its origins were in an act of divine manifestation in history, Yetziat Mitzrayim, physically intervening in history and disrupting the natural pattern of history to create the Jewish people. And the end point of Judaism is, one way or another, something similar. God intervening again in history to create a sense of universal peace and understanding of the primacy of the unseen over the material world. Bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shmo echad. That the whole world will be filled with the knowledge of God. Everyone will understand that the material world is an inadequate way of understanding existence. So